At 11:37 last night, Beijing Standard Time, inside a sub-basement operations center beneath the 2nd Department of the Joint Staff Department of the People's Liberation Army in Xicheng District, a 94-page document received its final authorization stamp. It was not a war plan. It was not a deployment order. It was a staged economic severance architecture, a formally sequenced, operationally detailed, and fully pre-positioned framework for decoupling the People's Republic of China from the global dollar system, not gradually, not symbolically, but structurally and permanently, in a window of no more than 72 hours once the activation threshold is crossed. And according to 4 people with direct knowledge of its contents, 2 serving officials inside Allied Pacific Intelligence Services, 1 former senior economist at the Bank for International Settlements, who maintains active relationships inside the Chinese financial establishment, and 1 Western diplomat currently stationed in Beijing, that threshold was crossed 41 minutes ago. I need you to stop everything you are doing right now and understand the full weight of what I am about to tell you. Because what happened in that basement last night was not a contingency exercise. It was not a planning rehearsal. It was the formal elevation of a document from draft classification to operational standby, meaning it now requires a single authorization from 1 individual to move from architecture to execution. That individual is not a general. He is not a central bank governor. He is the one person in the People's Republic of China whose signature on a single page would trigger a cascade of coordinated financial actions across 43 countries simultaneously, actions that would detach more than $3.2 trillion in sovereign reserves from dollar-denominated instruments within the first 18 hours and structurally strand American monetary policy in a position from which recovery would require not months, but decades. I'm Ann Applebum, and I have spent the last 25 years studying how great power rivalries end, not in the dramatic military confrontations that history books dramatize, but in the quiet, methodical, and almost invisible financial and institutional maneuvers that one side completes in full view of the other, while the other side argues about whether the threat is real. What I am watching right now in real time is the most consequential financial architecture activation since Bretton Woods. And if you are not subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on, do that right now, because what unfolds in the next 72 hours will either be quietly reversed through diplomatic back channels that the public will never hear about, or it will permanently alter the structure of global economic power in a way that no future American administration, Republican or Democrat, will have the tools to undo. Here is precisely what we know. And here is why every single detail matters. According to 5 independent sources, 3 from inside Pacific Rim Allied Intelligence Services, 1 from the Treasury Department's Office of International Affairs, who left that position 8 months ago and remains in close contact with current staff, and 1 from a senior figure inside the Institute of International Finance in Washington, who has been briefed on preliminary signals from Chinese counterpart institutions. The document elevated to operational standby last night represents the full maturation of a project that has been running inside the PLA's Financial Warfare Division since 2017. Its internal designation translates roughly as the Sequential Monetary Sovereignty Framework. Its operational purpose is the elimination of dollar dependency across the entire BRICS Plus trade and reserve system in a single coordinated action that is designed specifically to be too fast for the American Treasury and Federal Reserve to respond to in real time. The architecture works in 4 layers. The first layer is the pre-positioning of sovereign reserves. Over the past 31 months, according to data that is technically public but has not been aggregated and analyzed in the way that would make its implications visible, 14 nations inside the BRICS Plus grouping have quietly reduced their combined dollar-denominated reserve holdings by $840 billion, while simultaneously increasing gold holdings, yuan-denominated instruments, and positions in the new cross-border interbank clearing system that China finalized in December at a ceremony that Western financial press covered as a routine infrastructure update. It was not a routine infrastructure update. It was the completion of the last technical component required for the framework activated last night. The second layer is trade invoice redirection. According to Dr. Eswar Prasad, who holds the Talani Senior Professor of Trade Policy Chair at Cornell University and has written the most technically rigorous analysis of dollar displacement risk currently available in the academic literature, the threshold at which dollar invoice dominance in global trade becomes structurally irreversible on the downside is approximately 42%. Global dollar invoice share currently sits at 47%. The sequential monetary sovereignty framework, according to the source inside the BIS community, contains specific bilateral commitments from trade partners representing enough annual trade volume to push that number below 42% within the first 90 days of activation. Below 42%, the self-reinforcing network effects that have maintained dollar dominance for 80 years begin running in reverse. The system does not collapse. It deflates, slowly, permanently, and with a trajectory that no intervention can reverse once begun. The third layer is the one that Washington has been tracking and consistently underestimating. It is a set of 23 bilateral agreements signed between 2021 and 2024, each individually structured as routine currency swap or trade facilitation arrangements, each individually unremarkable, but collectively constituting a legally binding commitment network that activates in concert the moment the 94-page framework document receives its final authorization. 23 nations, pre-committed, pre-positioned, waiting for one signature. And the fourth layer is the reason this is happening now, at this specific moment, and not 6 months ago or 2 years from now. Now, let me walk you through the exact sequence of events that brought us to this morning, because this did not happen without a trigger, and the trigger was not random. Every step was deliberate. The sequence is the only thing that makes the stakes legible. Monday, February 23rd at 9:15 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Treasury Department issues a formal notice of sanction expansion targeting 34 Chinese financial institutions and 3 state-owned enterprises for what the notice describes as material support to Russian dual-use procurement networks. The sanctions are sweeping. They include, for the first time, secondary sanctions provisions that explicitly threaten European, Asian, and Middle Eastern financial institutions with correspondent banking exclusion if they maintain clearing relationships with the targeted Chinese entities. According to a senior European Central Bank official who spoke to a colleague of mine on Background, the secondary sanctions provisions were not discussed with G7 financial partners in advance. They were presented as a fait accompli at 9:15 a.m., and European financial regulators learned about them from the public treasury notice. Tuesday, February 24th at 6:30 p.m. Beijing time. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson delivers a statement that uses language not seen in Chinese official communications since 2010. Specifically, the phrase that the United States has crossed a threshold of economic coercion that China is no longer willing to treat as a negotiating context. That phrase is not diplomatic boilerplate. According to 2 scholars of Chinese Communist Party discourse who study the specific vocabulary used to signal internal escalation decisions, that exact formulation has appeared in Chinese official communications precisely 3 times in the post-reform era. Each time it preceded a structural policy shift within 96 hours. Wednesday, February 25th at 2:44 p.m. Beijing time. The People's Bank of China issues a technical operational circular to all state-owned commercial banks. The circular, classified as internal guidance, instructs institutions to complete a specific set of balance sheet restructuring procedures by end of business Friday. Two people familiar with those procedures describe them as identical in structure to the pre-positioning steps outlined in the Sequential Monetary Sovereignty Framework's operational checklist. Thursday, February 26th. Last night, 11:37 p.m., the framework reaches operational standby. Here is what you need to understand about the people who built this architecture and why their involvement tells you everything about how serious this is. Start with He Lifeng, currently serving as China's vice premier with specific responsibility for economic and financial policy. He Lifeng is not an ideologist. He is a technocrat with 40 years of institutional experience who spent 11 of those years inside China's regional development finance system, learning precisely how dollar dependency creates leverage points for American foreign policy coercion. He has said in multiple internal speeches that have been partially translated and circulated inside Western intelligence assessments that the question for China is not whether to reduce dollar dependency, but whether to do it in a controlled sequence or an uncontrolled one. The framework activated last night is his controlled sequence. The involvement of Saudi Arabia's monetary authority is the detail that should be landing with the force of a physical blow. Saudi Arabia is not a BRICS member. Saudi Arabia has maintained a dollar peg since 1986. Saudi Arabia's participation in any dollar displacement architecture was, until approximately 18 months ago, considered by virtually every serious Western analyst to be structurally impossible because of the petrodollar arrangement's function as the backbone of the U.S.-Saudi security relationship. According to the source inside the BIS community, Saudi Arabia has committed preliminary participation in layers 1 and 3 of the framework. Not full activation, but enough to cross the 42% invoice threshold. When the country whose oil exports created the petrodollar system participates in a framework designed to end the petrodollar system, you are no longer looking at a challenge to American financial primacy. You are looking at its potential termination. If you are finding this analysis valuable, hit the like button right now, because what I am about to tell you is the part that no mainstream financial outlet is currently reporting. And whether this information reaches the people who need to understand it before the window closes depends entirely on whether the algorithm surfaces it, and that depends on you engaging with it right now. The 94-page framework contains a provision that has no parallel in any financial architecture document I or any analyst I have consulted has ever seen. It is a retaliation sequencing mechanism, a pre-agreed, pre-committed escalation ladder that specifies in precise operational terms the exact financial measures that will be activated at each stage of any American counter-response. It means that if the Treasury Department attempts to respond to Layer 1 activation with expanded sanctions, Layer 2 automatically triggers without requiring any additional Chinese authorization. If Washington attempts to freeze dollar-denominated Chinese sovereign assets held in American custodial institutions, Layer 3 activates automatically. The framework is self-executing above the initial threshold. One signature starts it. After that, American responses accelerate it rather than stopping it. According to Dr. Barry Eichengreen, who holds the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Chair at the University of California, Berkeley, and is the most cited economic historian on the question of reserve currency transitions, the self-executing retaliatory ladder is the architectural innovation that makes this framework categorically different from every previous dollar challenge. Every previous challenge, the euro's rise, the SDR debate, early yuan internationalization, could be managed because American counterpressure slowed the challenger's momentum. A self-executing escalation ladder inverts that logic entirely. American counterpressure becomes the activation mechanism for the next stage. Washington's strongest tool becomes the framework's most reliable accelerant. This is, and I want to be precise, the scenario that every American monetary policy planner since the Nixon shock has identified as the single condition that cannot be managed with existing tools. a coordinated, pre-committed, self-executing challenge to dollar reserve dominance that is designed to weaponize the American response against American interests. I am Ann Applebaum, and I am telling you that we are closer to that scenario this morning than we have been at any point since the dollar replaced sterling as the world's reserve currency in 1944. Let me give you the three scenarios that now define the next 90 days, because one of them will happen, and understanding which one requires watching what Beijing does before Monday morning. Scenario 1, the framework is held at standby as leverage. Probability, 45%. The document does not activate. Beijing uses its existence and the American intelligence community's awareness of it as coercive leverage in back-channel negotiations over the February 23rd sanctions. The White House, through intermediaries, signals willingness to modify the secondary sanctions provisions affecting European and Asian financial institutions. Beijing accepts the modification as sufficient face-saving cover to stand the framework down without activating it. The 23 bilateral pre-commitment agreements remain in place for future use. The dollar remains dominant but loses another 3 to 5 percentage points of reserve share over the following 2 years as all 23 participating nations quietly accelerate their individual diversification programs. I assign this 45% probability because it requires both sides to want a contained resolution. And the current American sanctioning posture suggests Washington may not yet understand that a contained resolution requires American concession, not Chinese capitulation. Scenario 2, partial activation through layers 1 and 2. Probability 35%. Washington does not modify the sanctions. Beijing authorizes Layer 1 and Layer 2 activation, reserve repositioning, and trade invoice redirection, while holding Layers 3 and 4 in reserve. Dollar reserve share drops below 42% within 90 days. The Federal Reserve and Treasury respond with the tools available to them: moral suasion, liquidity provision, quiet outreach to wavering participants, and slow the trajectory without reversing it. The petrodollar arrangement enters a managed phase-out that takes 4 to 7 years to complete. American borrowing costs rise structurally. The dollar remains the world's leading reserve currency, but ceases to be the world's overwhelming reserve currency. America retains financial primacy, but loses financial hegemony. The distinction matters enormously. Hegemony means others have no real alternative. Primacy means America is the strongest among several options. Primacy is a recoverable position. Hegemony, once lost, has never in history been regained. I give this 35% because it requires Beijing to accept the costs of partial activation, retaliatory pressure, market volatility, diplomatic strain, without the full strategic payoff of complete execution. Scenario 3, full sequential activation, probability 20%. Washington doubles down on sanctions. The self-executing ladder runs all 4 layers within 30 days. 23 pre-committed nations move simultaneously. Dollar invoice share crosses below 42%. Saudi Arabia completes its Layer 3 commitment. The yuan does not replace the dollar. Nothing replaces the dollar cleanly. What emerges instead is a fragmented multipolar reserve system in which no single currency has the network dominance the dollar has held since 1944. Global trade finance becomes more expensive, more friction-laden, and more politically conditioned than at any point in the post-war era. American military power, which depends on the ability to finance deficit spending at low rates in your own currency, does not collapse. It contracts, slowly, structurally, across every theater simultaneously. And the world that emerges from that contraction is one that no American strategist has a model for, because no American strategist has ever had to build one. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because I am Ann Applebaum. I am watching the documents, tracking the data, and speaking to the people who understand what is at stake and are willing to tell someone who will tell you. The next 72 hours will show us whether the financial architecture that has underwritten American global leadership since 1944 survives this activation moment, or whether we are right now in this exact window living through the last hours in which the outcome can still be shaped. The decisions are being made, the mechanisms are in place, and almost no one outside those rooms has any idea what is about to happen.